And we are live. Thank you everyone for joining us. Gavin Stewart will be presenting Fixing Our Broken Science Policy Pipelines, Evidence-Based X. Over to you, Gavin, when you're ready. Gavin? Just bear with us for a moment. Here we go. Are you ready, Gavin?
I am, yep.
Yep, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Right, well, thanks everyone, and thanks for the invite to have this chat. I'm going to talk about fixing our broken science policy pipelines, and it's all about this idea of evidence-based X. So, really, just going to talk about why we need evidence synthesis to inform policy, this evidence-based X ideas, and then the challenges of trying to kind of get all of this achieved. I don't think most of it will be contentious. I think we'll all agree in this community that we need evidence synthesis and it needs to be good. But there might be some divergent ideas about how much methods harmonization we need and about how bad things are or aren't. So these are my views on that, and we'll see what you lot think. So normally I'd have to spend quite a lot of time on this slide explaining to people what decent evidence synthesis is, and I don't need to do that in this community, but it is worth making a couple of points. And the first point to make is that normal, inverted commas, scientists don't understand this. And that's a big issue for us. They don't understand, some of them don't understand why we need evidence synthesis. The ones that do understand that don't understand the difference between good evidence synthesis and bad evidence synthesis. And I think that's a real issue for our community, and we maybe need to think about how we address that a bit more. And the second thing to say is that, with buffoons like this wandering around saying evidence is whatever they say it is, then it's more important than ever that we have robust, transparent evidence synthesis at this point in time. But that's all I need to say. We need evidence synthesis to inform policy, and you all understand that. If we move on to this idea of EBX, evidence-based X, why do I think we need evidence-based X? And there are a few reasons, really. The first reason is to do with our methods work. So it is quite easy at the moment to kind of think, I'm doing evidence synthesis in this domain of application, say it's environmental science, and you think about, what does some kind of median review or evidence synthesis look like in that domain? And, you typically think of some kind of higher heterogeneity synthesis where it's, difficult to combine effect sizes. It's difficult, the pooled effect really doesn't mean anything at all. And you might have some kind of meta regression that explains some things, but you've got that very kind of high dimensional data where you've got, 15 studies and 506 reasons why they might vary. And you think about, You contrast that with some kind of typical clinical medical application where you've got 4 or 5 RCTs and a couple of them might be reasonably well done and a couple of them are pretty dodgy and ropey. You've got some kind of random effects meta-analysis trying to kind of sift out the truth from that. So you can kind of say, well, here are our methods for one and here are our methods for the other, and these are quite different things. Or you can think of it as no, that median can be very misleading, just as the pooled effect can be very misleading in that high heterogeneity meta-analysis. Really, what we've got here is a type of question. If we're interested in effectiveness or diagnostics or prognostics or impact, we've got some kind of a question, and then we've got some kind of data that's informing that question. And it might be high heterogeneity if it's ecological. It might be highly structured and hierarchical if it's the social sciences. It might be individual patient data if it's medical. So you've got the nature of the data. And if you think of it as the type of problem and the nature of the data, then the methods become generic. Because you can say, I can use that individual patient data type hierarchical approach in my social science data, or I can use the approaches that ecologists take to kind of trying to think about type 1 errors when they do meta-regressions in my medical meta-analysis. And it doesn't become evidence-based medicine and evidence-based ecology and evidence-based social science. It just becomes EBX. So I think there's something about harmonizing our methods so that we don't get the research waste and the incoherence that's quite important. The other reason that I think this is important is that we increasingly have to deal with trying to support policymakers making complex decisions in complex decision space. And the example I like to use for this is food security. If you think about food systems and the way we produce our food, it's got massive ramifications for climate change because it's one of the largest contributors to carbon dioxide emissions. It's got huge implications for health because if you think kind of very broadly, an awful lot of our health issues are because we either don't eat enough of the right things or we eat too much of the wrong things. That's a kind of very coarse generic statement, but it's actually quite scalable. So we've got climate issues, we've got health issues, we've got all sorts of social science and equity issues to do with the affordability and distribution of food. So there's social science in there as well. And that's kind of actually encompassed in most of the definitions of what food security is. We've got a very strong social science component. And it's got a huge ecological component because we've got a massive biodiversity crisis. We're losing species and habitats at a really alarming rate. And the biggest driver of that biodiversity loss, you've guessed it, is agriculture. It's habitat destruction for agriculture. So if we're going to kind of try and support broad level decision making in that space, then you need to do evidence synthesis to inform that decision across these different domains. And if we're using different methods and different norms, then how can we have a coherent output in that space? So that's the other kind of big reason for transitioning to EBX, in my view. And I've been involved with Cochrane and Campbell and Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. And when I look at the variation in the methods, it's more to do with communities of practice and scale and the resource that's available than any kind of philosophical difference in the nature of the evidence or any kind of rational need for different methodologies in different domains. So it's quite easy to write methodological expectations for Campbell, for example, which is a very, very broad church. And you've got climate groups there that are very similar to environmental groups and environmental evidence synthesis at the one extreme, and you've got groups that kind of push into the public health sphere. And that's not a barrier to writing messier standards saying these are the methodological expectations for a Campbell review. So I think we can do this kind of broader harmonization a bit more. And that's why I think it's important to do that. But there are big challenges. And the first challenge is the nature of our evidence. Now, again, another point I'd really like to make is this is something that primary scientists just do not understand this problem. Whereas we do. We've all sat there doing review after review where we pick up the paper and we try and go, what on earth have they done in this paper? Why is this study design that I am looking at? Why does the data in table 2, why is that inconsistent with the figure? How many degrees of freedom have they got in this mixed model? What is the standard error? We've all been there, we've done that, we've struggled with those things. And we've also seen all the hacking and the harking and the fact that, there's a p-value and an abstract from this paper, and it says exactly the opposite to what our effect size says when we extract a decent, robust effect size. So this is a big challenge. And lots of people have said that we have problems with our evidence. Doug Altman's seminal paper, absolutely brilliant. The problem is, I would argue that what Doug said, that could be written again today in any domain of applied science. This problem isn't getting better. We're not solving this problem. And I think it really need to start wrestling with this a bit more. And it's not just Doug as well. I really like this little opinion piece by Richard Horton. And I like these two sentences particularly, where he says, that our studies are afflicted with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analyses, flagrant conflicts of interest, an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance. And, that kind of summarizes it in one word. And, we can write whole papers, and indeed we do write whole papers about each of those components. And then this little bit where he says poor methods get results. And they do, and we see it time and time again, and it drives me nuts. So it's time to really start thinking about how we do something about this. And of course, it's not just medicine. The psychologists have discovered their reproducibility crisis and told us all that we should pre-register things and have open methods and open data. And, some of us turned around and said, yeah, we've been doing that for a little while now. But nonetheless, it's really positive. And the whole kind of open science movement that's come out of that is mainstreamed, and that's all really good. So the psychologists are aware of this. And if we kind of try and generalize it further, I don't know if any of you have seen this work looking at the distribution of Z values, where they scraped 1.1 million Z values from the general scientific literature and came up with this fantastic distribution. So we're aware of the problems of the hacking, the harking, the selective reporting, the poor methods, the poor reporting. It's really devaluing everything. And there's less meta-epidemiology in some domains than in others, but I also really like this paper by Hannah Fraser and colleagues looking at the prevalence of questionable research practices in ecology and evolution. It's a really nice, smart paper. One of the little tricks that they pulled was asking people what they did, but also what they'd seen other people do. And that's what the different coloured bars are there. But it's just making the same point again that, whatever domain you're in, this is a problem. Our research is pretty ropey. Fixing it. Okay, reporting guidelines. There's a bit of me that absolutely hates reporting guidelines. Okay, they're boring to read, they're boring to write, they're boring to adhere to, but we need more of them, particularly in areas where they're not particularly prevalent. So reporting guidelines, really important, obviously, for reporting, but they also have a huge role in driving improvements in the methods. Because if you talk about what it is you have to report, then to a certain extent, that's telling you what you have to do as well. Alongside that, in some domains, we need much more work on core common outcomes, because it isn't just that people are measuring things badly and not reporting what they've done. They're also reporting things in 50,000 different ways when they don't need to. And if you go and talk to primary scientists about this, they'll say that they do need to. But if you dig with them a little bit, a lot of the time, this is just incoherence. They've measured it that way because that's how they did it last time, or that's how the person who trained them did it, or that's the kit that they've got in the cupboard. Okay, so much more thinking about what are we measuring? Why are we measuring it? Okay, you could do the whole thing about what's a meaningful effect size at the same time. What's a minimally important difference in this context for this field? All of that kind of work needs, I think we need to really pay attention to those things. And this is representing a big cultural shift, which is always hard. I always think about those reviews about hand washing, where there's a fantastic review that says if you wash your hands, it's absolutely brilliant for reducing infection rates in hospitals. And there's another review that says if you tell people to wash their hands, it has absolutely no effect whatsoever. So we're kind of in that situation here. We know there's a problem. We know what we need to do to fix the problem, but persuading scientists to do it is hard. And I'd like to just diverge slightly and talk a little bit about how evidence synthesis has an important role in identifying divergent data and kind of doing the sifting for this, because although this is well known in some fields, it's not fully understood in others, I don't think. So a little divergence into pain here. And this little story starts with a systematic review and meta-analysis. And there were three divergent studies. So three studies with a much bigger effect size than all the other studies. And they all came from the same group. And the risk of bias assessment and exploration of heterogeneity didn't explain it. And correspondence with the authors didn't explain it. And so there was a really wise editorial decision at this point to exclude these studies from the analysis. I'm not sure I would have been that bold. I would definitely have wanted to see sensitivity analysis and so on, but I'd have been worried about type 1 errors and deviations from protocols. So I'd probably have kind of included them and done some kind of fudge. Anyway, the editors made the right call, as you'll see, and excluded these studies. And because we'd, kind of not really got anywhere with what's going on here, we decided that we would dig a little bit more deeply. So we wrote a protocol and retrieved all the back pain studies by that group. And eight of the studies had these divergent results from the evidence base, so very different results. So either these guys are doing something that's so effective that the world needs to really know and understand what it is they're doing because it's an order of magnitude better than everything else, or there's something else going on. So our standard assessments of risk of bias and participant characteristics don't identify any concerns. There's no problem. Responses from the lead author didn't do anything. But when we did trustworthy screening, when we started to identify concerns about research governance, data duplication, data plausibility at baseline, we were lucky in the sense that because these were randomized control trials, we could look at whether or not we had uniform distributions on the baseline covariates. And we found that they weren't uniform distributions. And, you can't say that means it wasn't randomized properly, but you can kind of say, that's improbable. And then when that happens again and again and again, across study after study, then you start saying, this is becoming even more improbable and harder to explain if these studies were properly randomized. Okay. So we now had serious concerns about these studies. So what happens when you approach the editors to say there's a problem here? And we get everything. We get everything from journals and journal editors being very well behaved, looking at their Committee on Publication Ethics guidelines and retracting the studies. But you also get editors being reassured by their journal's fair review process, and thinking that this kind of work represents unjustifiable attack and is academic intimidation. So journals have got very different responses to these kinds of issues. And that's important, not just because of the integrity of a scientific record, but that if you're getting that with journal editors, what can we expect from our reviewers and from the authors and from primary scientists who don't really do very much or any evidence synthesis? Kind of just shows how large scale the problem is. People might say, well, this is, yeah, you might have a point, Gav, but this is a bit odd and it's just a few studies. It's just a few questionable studies. It's not really that important, is it? Well, we went off in another study, we went off and we reanalyzed all the meta-analyses that had included those studies by taking them out. And look what it does to the effect sizes. Okay, if you take those studies out of the meta-analyses and the guidelines, it switches to conclusion. So this is having massive implications for practice. Those studies have completely contaminated literature and they've completely driven the guidance that's out there. Okay, so it isn't just a few questionable studies. These problems completely contaminate our evidence base and make our decisions completely erroneous. And I think this is quite a nice little quote here. We no longer worry about being too skeptical. We worry that we are not skeptical enough. And this is, this is a group of folk who've seen it and done it as far as evidence synthesis goes. So I think that really says it all. I'll let it speak for itself. That's our little kind of journey through pain and our discussion of the problems of the quality of the evidence base. So I'll stop bashing the poor scientists, the producers of the primary science, who are the kind of bottom right in our triangle here. Let's talk a little bit about policy and practice communities. And we've got problems there as well. I mean, how often have you been commissioned to do a review when the policy is already being implemented? I've sat in startup meetings where I've kind of tried to start unpacking that question, and start having those discussions about what outcomes are meaningful and what magnitude of effects are you looking for. And I've almost literally been told, well, sonny boy, you tendered for this and you won the tender. That's your problem. You go away and figure it out. And it's like, well, I know I can toddle off and write a nice paper and I've got another 6 months of funding for this. That's not a problem. But I also know that there's absolutely no way that this is going to inform policy in any kind of meaningful way, which is what this work is intended to do. And the taxpayer is paying for this work. And the way that we've just interacted now just shows you don't even understand what it is you're asking me to do. So sometimes it isn't just a case of we need to listen to the policy community and they need to we need to make sure that we're measuring the outcomes that matter to them, and look at the interventions that matter to them. Those are problems that we don't do that enough. But sometimes the problem is the way the policy and practice community engages with us or with the primary scientists. Okay, so it's quite often disjointed and discordant, and it needs thinking about. If we think about the funders and commissioners of research, it's usually a mix of those two groups, the policy and practice community and the primary and scientists. And sometimes they may even be the same people, like you might have people from the policy community who have PhDs. And that means that they're meant to know about and understand science. The bit that's lacking is the purple triangle in the middle, evidence synthesis. And the bit that ties all these things together is evidence synthesis. So again, if you think about, let's think about that review that you do to inform the policy. Let's pretend that there's some reasonable studies there. So you're able to kind of say something, let's pretend that you've got lots of coherence and that you've got rational, coherent decision making from the policy community. And let's pretend that there's some limitations in the evidence base. So you're able to say, well, probably this and probably that, but we're not sure about A, B, and C. That we're not sure about A, B, and C never, ever, ever feeds into the funding loop. Okay. And usually it's not that. Usually you end up doing that review. It's an incoherent mess, and you say the evidence base is a mess and we can't tell what on earth is going on here. Come back in 10 years' time, there've been another heap of studies that have been funded, but do they address any of those problems of it being an incoherent mess? If you updated your meta-analysis, would it make any difference at all? No. You still have a heap of studies at high risk of bias with extreme heterogeneity, and you wouldn't understand anything. Now, if the funding decisions were predicated on, we need studies to plug the gaps in this evidence synthesis, they need to be designed explicitly to sort out those uncertainties, we might start making some progress. So I really think that evidence synthesis needs to be central in this in a way that it just isn't at the moment. I'd be interested in what you all think about that and maybe how we could try and start pushing in that direction. So not good. And lastly, the last challenge that we've got is ourselves and our own methods. And there's a few slides on this. So poor synthesis, it just remains prevalent, especially in domains outside the evidence-based lexicons. Can we have a moratorium on bad synthesis and just stop doing it? No, it's just nuts. If you pick up your high impact journals, you go and look at Nature and Science and look at the evidence synthesis in it. No. Yes, I have to mention vote counting again because it's incredibly prevalent. There's a lot of domains where evidence synthesis is vote counting. It might be dressed up as some kind of model, but it comes down to vote counting. It doesn't look at effect magnitude, and it doesn't look at precision in any kind of meaningful way. And people justify that because of dealing with complexity. They want to answer the question, the data is diverse and difficult to synthesize. Oh, well, we'll vote count. We'll do some form of vote counting, wittingly or unwittingly. And this has the dual problems of leading to research waste, but it also devalues good synthesis. Okay, so I think that's a real problem as well. People don't understand what good synthesis is because we publish so much bad synthesis, and you can get bad synthesis published in very high impact journals. Well, why are you going to spend 3 years doing a decent meta-analysis and systematic review on something if you can just write an essay and get it published with a little bit of a crap synthesis of 2 data sets that you've managed to bolt together? Why bother doing good stuff if you can get the bad stuff published? So this is one that really gets my goat. Divergent norms. So we've kind of talked a little bit about this in terms of the EBX idea. Philosophically, it's evidence synthesis is evidence synthesis. And so why is publishing without protocols, or not doing risk of bias assessments, or the synthesis without thinking about effect sizes or precision? Why is lack of strength of evidence assessment acceptable ever in any context? And I think methodologists need mechanisms to challenge these inappropriate norms. And the problem there is that what's acceptable in one field seems to be different to what's acceptable in another. So we need to try and challenge these inappropriate norms, even if they're not in our field. Related to that, methodologists need to read the literature beyond their domain of application. So if you are doing methods work, then please, please, please make sure that you have read the relevant methods work in other domains. Okay. Don't publish your specific application as a new method unless it really is. Okay. It isn't an inferential synthesis matrix. It's a table of study characteristics, and we've been using them for years. It's not a novel framework for assessing X. It's 1.5 components of an existing framework with 500,000 citations. It's been badly interpreted and introduced to a new audience and sold as novel. This happens time and time again, and we need to stop it. We need to stop doing this. We do need good knowledge translation. So if you see methods being used in one domain and you think, hey, that would be really cool if people in this domain started using it, it's fantastic. We need a really nice knowledge translation piece to say, these guys are doing that. Look, this is what it all is. This is what it means. Why don't we do it? And we need good methods research. There's a dearth of good methods research. Meta-epidemiology there's hardly any good meta-epidemiology done. Would really help inform our methods. But can we drop the overhyped and under-researched guidance? This is one that really pisses me off. Right, I need to talk a bit about rapid reviews and maps in this context as well. So I kind of view these things as having come about from trying to help make evidence synthesis more relevant to policy decisions. And two of the big problems with kind of, wheeling out our standard box of tricks and doing a systematic review and a meta-analysis, or even multiple systematic reviews and meta-analyses and putting them into a decision model, that takes time. It takes time, and the scope is very highly focused. So to deal with those problems, let's do rapid reviews. Sounds sensible. And to deal with the scope, let's do big maps. And again, that sounds sensible. So I have no problem with rapid reviews being done to expedite synthesis. And I've got no problem to speed it up. And I've got no problem with evidence and gap maps to say this is the evidence that's out there. But both of them are getting oversold and misused. There's really good guidance on what both are for and how to do them, and it just isn't being followed. And again, it's devaluing real evidence synthesis. There are whole teams of people out there in certain areas who, particularly kind of on the government interface, who do evidence evaluation, but none of them have ever done a meta-analysis. And a lot of them don't actually understand what a meta-analysis is. And I think that's a problem. So don't take this as me thinking that we shouldn't do rapid review and that we shouldn't do evidence and gap maps. But I do have these concerns about how their use is creeping over the line into informing decisions when it really, really shouldn't. And it's another thing we need to push back from. So there's plenty to get upset about. Okay. Pick up the latest issue of your high impact journal of choice. You'll find hacked and hacked primary papers that are poorly reported. You'll find flawed syntheses that do vote counting or just don't make sense, or don't have protocols, don't do risk of bias assessments, don't have strength of evidence. Read the latest conveniently compliant policy brief masquerading as an evidence-based product. No, some people are even extolling their methodology as evidence-based when you sit there and you look at it and you go, what's all of this? Read a new funding call that doesn't know enough about the existing evidence or an evidence synthesis to address the strength of evidence gaps. Just happens again and again and again. Be angry. Don't despair. Be cross about this. Let's try and change it. It shouldn't be like that, but it is. And I hope it's better than it used to be. All this bad evidence synthesis that I'm ranting about is there because evidence synthesis is mainstreaming, and at least some people are starting to be aware that there should be evidence synthesis of some form. They're just not doing it very well. Tools and guidance to do it well are proliferating. The kind of tools that are being produced to help with synthesis, to help with stages of review, it's fantastic. There is loads of methods guidance. Now, the guidance and the tools, some of it's good, some of it's not so good, as I've been ranting about. Early career researchers are smart and want change. Okay, people are coming into this evidence synthesis field and working hard in it and doing really good stuff, and they're really committed. And that's the real hope for the future, in my view. And I just want to say, persist. Okay, the late career researchers will retire or die. And when that happens, hopefully fixed effects models will too. Paradigms change. Okay. And this current impact at any cost science policy paradigm needs to go. And it will. It will change. That's inevitable. And robust evidence synthesis is going to be at the heart of anything worth doing in this space. So if you're doing robust evidence synthesis, it might be hard. You might not have very much support. The funders might not understand it. The people round about you might not understand it. But you're doing something that matters and you have to keep going. The challenge for us as a broader community, or I think the challenge for us as the broader community, is trying to engage more with the primary scientists to really start sorting this out. And I will end my rant at that point. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Gavin. We've got 10 minutes for questions if you're happy to take some.
Absolutely, no problem.
I'm just, we've got a question from Ismaila. You can either talk or I'll ask your question. It's up to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, my name is Ismail. I'm speaking from Nigeria. So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Yeah. So yeah, evidence informed decision making is really important as in Africa and elsewhere. But sometimes policies and decisions are being taken before or after the evidence is available. So how can we make sure that the evidence is available to feed into policy and decisions before those decisions are being taken? And how can evidence synthesis help us to achieve that? Thanks so much.
Yeah, well, it's non-trivial, isn't it? What I'm ranting about here is when it's avoidable. No, policy, the policy community need to make decisions. Sometimes there might be a crisis, even decisions that you can see coming down from the horizon, and it's like we really should be sorting this one out. They're still going to need to make a decision, even if they haven't really assembled the evidence. So there's kind of lots of different things to unpack in how do we sort all of this out. But the bit that I'm kind of saying we should stop doing is basically doing reviews to then cherry pick the components that support an existing policy. And you see that game being played quite a lot, and it's a form of research waste, really. I think that idea, the triangle that I put in with the coherence. So these ideas of living review and this kind of thing, if that became coherent, that would be good, because it might be that you've got policy X in place, you toddle along and you do your evidence synthesis after policy X is in place, and it provides some support for it, but there's a lot of uncertainty. The funders take note of the uncertainty and commission primary studies that are good, well conducted, that plug those gaps. The evidence synthesis gets updated in some kind of living review. The policy community look at it and go, ooh, A is more cost effective than B. We're going to switch to A, even though we were doing B in some kind of adaptive cycle. So the idea of that rational, coherent process is there. Getting it, we're a long way from it. And I think I'm not saying that all policymakers who make decisions under uncertainty are wrong. I fully accept that most decisions are made under uncertainty. So I think it's about doing evidence synthesis faster, more efficiently, all the kind of AI work that's being done at the moment, so that it's easier and quicker to assemble good, high quality evidence. If we can drive up the standards of the primary research, do evidence synthesis in a responsive, timely manner, and have these living reviews, all of that should help with that in theory. But we're a long way from that being reality.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. We've got a question from Wolfgang. He says, "Hi, Gavin. Thank you for your uplifting talk. To continue on this cheerful path, here is my question. Regardless of the quality of evidence we produce, the rise in science skepticism is worrisome. What can we do to counteract this?"
Yeah, it's kind of tricky because I'm saying we're doing the science really badly, and we are. And I think we need to shout that loudly, and that provides more grist to the mill of science skeptics. That's a problem. But I've kind of turned that on its head and say if we don't start sorting these problems out and doing good science instead of bad science, then we're going to be wrong about decisions time and time again, and it's just devaluing the whole thing. So we're actually playing into their hands. But yeah, I'd be interested in what other people think. Maybe we could have a chat about it, a conversation. It's a big problem. I agree.
Thank you. Thomas has said, to what extent do you think that creating the underlying living evidence infrastructure, such as the one spearheaded by Evidence Synthesis Infrastructure Collaborative, can help to address the issues you identify?
Yeah, well, I think as part of that kind of living evidence infrastructure and speeding up review, it will be able to help a lot. My main concern about that is with the quality of the underlying data. I think that's the big problem, and it's that engaging with scientists as well as the policy community to try and make sure that the stuff that's going into it is robust. That's the really big challenge, particularly when we move outside the kind of standard evidence-based domains.
Thank you. We do have time for one very quick question if anyone has any more. Just before that, you've got a lot of thank yous. There's a hello from Poland.
Hello,
Um,
Poland.
uh, if no one else has any questions, I will just simply leave you with this pondering question. So, how are we meant to trust evidence?
At the moment, I wouldn't. At the moment, I'm deeply skeptical. You know, if I pick up a paper now, I'm more skeptical than I ever was. And I think Richard Horton's right that if you think that if you say somewhere between misleading and downright wrong, I reckon about 50% of our publications, if you look at the main conclusion, I think they're wrong. And you can try that for yourselves, you know, go and have a look at it. Really do a deep, deep dig, not just risk of bias, real deep dig. Try and recreate the data, run some simulations, look at it really hard, and it'll start unraveling in front of you. Um, and I think it's a massive problem, and we need to turn it around. Yeah. I think the way we turn it around is by doing robust evidence synthesis. Yeah. Yeah. I trust a good systematic review and I don't trust anything else.
Thank you very much. That's all we have time for. Thank you again, Gavin.
No worries. Nice to chat to everyone. Stay frosty, one and all. Keep going.
Bye.